Hello, everybody. Gus, be careful, okay? As you're driving. All right, we're gonna give people just 1 minute or so to enter into the room, and then we'll go ahead and get started, and others can join us when they are able to arrive. All right, let's do it. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to meeting number 5 of the HAWTAC. I think you all know why you're here and what we're going to be doing, but I wanted to provide a little bit of a framing for our activity today, our discussion. But before we dive into the substance, I did want to cover a couple housekeeping matters. The first is it would be fantastic if you're able to, and not currently driving, to have your camera on. We really appreciate being able to see your faces and have a group conversation, and understand if you're not in a place or a situation where you're able to do that. Um, Also, we're going to continue for our discussion today using the raised hand emoji to help make sure folks get an opportunity to talk and add to the discussion. And I might take some folks out of turn, particularly if they haven't spoken up much. We want to make sure everybody gets an opportunity for airtime. And so don't be startled if there's a little bit of out of turn calling on folks. We will make sure that we come back around and make sure the folks at the front of the line also get their opportunity to talk as well. So starting today, we are going to be talking about the acceleration agreement portion of the housing acceleration process. So we've already talked about referral and audit. And we know that once you've completed that audit and you have the findings, the next step is there's 6 months in order to enter into an acceleration agreement. And so today we're going to be talking about some of those salient details and policy questions that are really pertaining to that 6-month period. And we've listed the high level questions for discussion in your agenda today. And I want to kind of place us in context of the TAC and the RAC meetings. So we've had these TAC meetings, and where we've just kind of bolted our way through all of the aspects of the process, with today being the culminating piece of the process with the acceleration agreement. We've done that in anticipation of a RAC meeting that will be upcoming on April 30th, where DLCD staff are going to talk with RAC members about sort of high-level policy issues related to components of the process. And so we wanted to make sure that you all had an opportunity to noodle on and discuss and provide input on each of those pieces before that meeting. After the RAC meeting on the 30th, we're going to circle back around and start talking about some of the details, maybe with some alternatives for you to respond to, and start diving in more deeply to the complexities, as if it hasn't gotten complicated enough, but some of the details of alternatives, which will then help DLCD as they go about the rulemaking process. So today we're in part 3 of the speed through the process in anticipation of the first RAC meeting, where the HAWTAC really gets to, or the RAC gets to grapple with the accountability process. And then we're going to swing back around and start talking about some of these details. And as the meetings continue, this group will help inform those agendas. What are those things that you really want to spend more time doing a deep dive into? And so we look forward to that feedback as well. But before we jump into the discussion for today, we wanted to make sure we're all level set on what is the acceleration agreement part of the process. And for that, Thea is going to provide a little bit more information.
Thanks so much, Cadence, and hi, everybody. It's great to see you. You know me, I do not love to be super formal, but I did put together a little slide thing for right now because there's, some of this is hard to hold in our heads without a visual. So I am going to share my screen to start with. All right. I think y'all seeing that? No, not seeing that? Dang it. Now? We good? All right. Great. So first I wanted to actually step back a little bit and highlight again our racial equity framework for decision making. So just to sort of reroot us in the in this framework that we're using as sort of the backbone of this process. And for this conversation in particular today, I highlighted a few particularly relevant categories within the racial equity framework that occurred to me, but and to Sean and Cadence as well. I do want to say that, as always, this is the work of the agency to work through this framework, but I really want to sort of continually keep it open and revisit this to hear the thoughts and feedback from this TAC as we work through this. So either, in this room, or feel free to reach out to me separately to talk about it. So I just wanted to point out these three categories that seemed relevant: historical inequities. Here we, just really want to ensure that we're acknowledging that the playing field is not level for a lot of communities, and that our work here needs to be centered around recognizing and correcting for the harms that have been perpetrated by our state, our cities, the field of planning, builders, and to continue to hold ourselves accountable to do that work. And that sort of leads us to the accountability category, where in this context, we're not just talking about keeping cities accountable to the state, which is part of the program that we're working through, but also to ensure that the accountability of the work is building toward equitable outcomes. Finally, I really want to draw our minds to sort of the benefits and burdens element, that the decisions that we're making in the rulemaking process do not unduly harm traditionally marginalized groups of people or unduly benefit traditionally privileged groups of people. So these are just some sort of tenets that we can come back to that might be useful in framing this conversation a little bit. So again, feel free to reach out or bring it up in this conversation. The space is open to a conversation about equity within the very technical elements of the rulemaking process. So with this sort of as the foundation, here, I'm trying to break your eyeballs. Do not read this. But just to say today that we're going to do a deep dive on ORS 197A 130 sub 6 through 10, the Housing Acceleration Agreement between jurisdictions and DLCD. So when we left off, we've been talking about the audit process. And we'll just jump right back in to where we were. So once DLCD and the jurisdiction have the results of that audit, they'll review those barriers that were identified and figure out a pathway to respond. We can start by talking about what's actually in the statute, which I'll say is kind of, I don't know, more and less prescriptive than the approach to the audit. It's written in a slightly different way. So we'll just pull it back a little bit. Within 6 months of the audit being completed, the city and DLCD have to agree on a housing acceleration agreement, which proportionally addresses the issues that were identified in the audit. And there are several things that DLCD has to do and several things that a city has to do. That is in the statute. This is paraphrasing, but I think it essentially gets the point across. DLCD has to provide financial assistance, regulatory support, technical assistance, and assist the city in identifying and securing additional public funds specifically to address the issues that were identified. On the other side, if in the audit, DLCD identifies factors that affected housing production, affordability, and choice that result from jurisdictions, policies, and practices, the city has to adopt an amended HPS, an amended housing production strategy. So that HPS has to include, has to address all of the barriers and include these elements that are up on the screen here, in addition to typical actions that are found in housing production strategies. So that, just to walk you through it, allocating funds to support housing production, affordability, and choice, and specifically also including funds that are necessary to develop public facilities and infrastructure to build housing. Implement measures that increase the availability of development-ready land specifically. Implement procedures to streamline housing production and reduce costs, and this also includes modifying development code, approval criteria, and procedures. So just thinking through how to streamline. And implement temporary emergency measures to support housing production. Finally, so those are the things that are in the statute essentially, and we'll review those a little bit more carefully as we're talking through it. But that's the sort of the big picture of what's required by both parties. If the city either doesn't enter into an agreement with the DLCD or doesn't follow the terms set out in the Housing Acceleration Agreement, DLCD has license to seek an enforcement order from LCDC to ensure compliance. And LCDC can employ various measures until the city reaches compliance. And that includes, here, I'm gonna forget the screen, directly applying model ordinances until that city can come into compliance. So applying model ordinances, procedures, actions, and also including anti-displacement measures, reducing maximum review timelines for local processes, and that also includes requiring housing to be reviewed via a ministerial process in some cases, implementing specific actions to waive or amend local ordinances, and possibly withholding revenue under LCDC's existing authority that could be used to support the city's compliance efforts. What that all looks like, still wide open. And this is the subject of the conversation today. So sort of with this in our pocket, we will jump into the conversation. I'm going to stop my share, but we can pull these up if it's useful, or get right into the statute and look at that if that's useful also. And I think I'm going to hand it back to Cadence, who I think is going to move us on to the discussion portion. Thank you.
All right, folks. Before we get started with the first question, I want to just open up to see if there are any questions with what Thea has provided thus far, so that we can make sure we're kind of on a level playing field before we dive in. Okay, it's all clear. So the first question is, what should be considered in determining proportionate response? So as Thea mentioned in the beginning of her talk today, as the city and DLCD are working towards an acceleration agreement, the things included in that agreement need to be proportionate to the city's basis for referral and informed by the audit itself. So in your minds, what do you think are relevant components that should be considered when discussing proportionate? Go ahead, Michael.
Uh, it seems like this is obvious, but each of the criteria for evaluation should be evaluated. And so like each of the price buckets and the equity metrics um, independently determine whether some remedy associated with each of those different categories. So you do well on one, that doesn't get you out of another one, but you also don't have to worry about the one you do well on.
And are there in your minds some components that would require more dramatic response or significant response than other kind of errors or like performance measures that they're not hitting?
You're right. I guess I'm not sure this is your question, but my perception is that the each of the targets is equally important in the eyes of the law, and each should have its own predictable remedies, some of which might overlap, but at least that's the way I think about it.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, this may not be possible for like first round of referrals, but once we all have an established set of metrics, I guess existing progress, all these communities are going to be starting from different places. And so if cities are showing that they are making progress, but they're still deficient, it could indicate that they are making good faith efforts, and therefore, the state should consider them a good faith partner in that. So yeah, that's definitely a factor that could be taken under consideration.
Yeah, let's dive into that for just 1 second, because the data is tricky, right? So sort of showing progress over time with the way the quantitative data works isn't particularly reliable. And so exploring what, like, I like your idea of good faith effort. Like, are they a cooperative partner in working towards solutions? And so can you talk a little bit, if absent sort of reliable quantitative data, what you would use to sort of show good faith effort towards making a difference?
I think, going off of the existing Goal 10 framework, making, if they have shown efforts to make sure that they continue to have a surplus of housing capacity lands based on the actual needs from their housing need, identified in the HNAs, that would indicate that they are moving in the right direction with the tools they had at the time, before the new ONA process.
Right. Great. Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, I think it's and this is, I think everyone's kind of talking about some of the same concepts, but it's sort of the proportionality is a comparison of the severity of the problem based on the indicators that we were just talking about. But then I think that's also compared with a municipality's ability to affect change, because at the end of this process, punishing a jurisdiction in a way that does not create more housing and does not address something that does not address the problem is just an exercise in futility. So I think you need to compare the severity of the problem with what is under the jurisdiction's ability to change things. And to that extent, I think looking at an existing HNA, HCA, HPS to see what has been done, kind of compared to what needs to be done in those planning documents, is a good way to start. And I'll just, and I think there's a way to kind of look at this quantitatively. If a jurisdiction has made a bunch of changes with its land use practices, you can see that there's enough land available for middle housing, higher density, things like that. then I think you get at this idea that there's a good faith effort being made, and what's left, what's still under the jurisdiction's ability to create change may be limited. I mean, if you have some residential land that's on the other side of a railroad, and the railroad doesn't want to put in a crossing, and ODOT isn't helping you get to that point, then it's kind of outside of the jurisdiction's ability to make change. As is providing, adequate supply of housing land, if their inventory is used up. And again, those go to documents that we all have. We have buildable lands inventories. They may not be updated. That may be a part of the technical assistance that's provided, but it seems like we'd be able to kind of at least make some determination as to what a municipality needs to and is able to do.
Yeah. Sean, did you want to add something?
Yeah, actually, man, my headphones are terrible. So question on that, just as a follow-up. So one of the points that we weren't quite able to get into last meeting on the audit process is that there are going to be times when, like as part of the audit process, we can identify barriers that are at the state level, right? Like say you have that ODOT facility that's like, there's a railroad and they don't want to put in improvements, right? And kind of diving into that. And, that's explicitly intended as part of this. We didn't really talk much about how to do that or how to operationalize that. One of the questions that kind of comes here is one of the responsibilities that DLCD has is kind of serving as a mediator, right? We can't necessarily control what ODOT does, but we can certainly get together a meeting. And so maybe one of the follow-ups I have as part of that is like, what would be a productive relationship there that we could operationalize in this framework? Because I think that's like one of the powerful aspects of this is that we have the ability to like coordinate different entities around this idea of barriers to housing through this process. So just as a follow-up to that.
Thoughts on how DLCD could participate? Yeah, Gus, is that something that you wanted to offer information on?
No, I commented on the original question, so I can hold off if you'd prefer.
Okay, yeah, hold the thought for just a minute. Sam, and then Anne.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that this process would allow particular projects to be prioritized in funding. And so one I think very helpful role that DLCD could play is that they would have their own objective metrics that says these are the projects that are going to be most effective in supplying in leading to greater housing development, which is something that the legislature went in a different direction on in the last session. But yeah, DLCD lending their voice once they have gone through this audit process of saying these are the infrastructure projects that are needed to facilitate more housing. I think it would be a much more efficient and objective way to prioritize funding.
Great, thank you. All right, Gus, your turn. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, hold that. Sorry, Anne, you put your hand down.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I jumped ahead to make sure I remembered to do that. Well, thinking about other agencies and impacts on housing, I always think about wetlands, which provide a certain function. However, without enough mitigation bank credits in our different regions, and it would be great to, in addition to, of course, infrastructure funding, have funding to create more regional and wetland mitigation banks and help address the issue of wetland mitigation, because that affects so much of our lands, and it adds time to the process and it adds costs to the process. And if there aren't enough mitigation credits in your bank, I mean, it actually stops the process.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And one thing to keep in mind as we're talking about this too, let's think about this process-wise, because like, yes, I agree that like wetland mitigation credits and funding to support that is important, but that's also like, that's something that DLCD doesn't have control over in this process. It's like a legislative decision, but more thinking, well, how do we get Department of State Lands to the table is kind of that part that I'm trying to think through, is like, how do we facilitate that relationship?
Yeah, and it might be a both and. It would be interesting about sort of what does DLCD learn in a year or for a biennial kind of legislative look? What are the takeaways from the acceleration agreements and audits that DLCD has learned that would affect big change? Because I think that is part of the process. We know that there are some things within cities' control, and there are a lot of things that are not. And a subset of the things that are not within the city's control may be impacted by what the state chooses to do. And so the more you hear or you find that there are things that are within the state's control, and you can be a mouthpiece for funneling that information to the governor and legislature, I think could be really helpful. And then, as you're pointing out, Sean, is like in the actual event that Albany is going through an acceleration agreement, what are the things that you can specifically agree to as DLCD to help them remove barriers? And that would be interesting to see, is there a regional solutions or a division of state lands or some other kind of convening that you could do that could help them in the immediate? Yeah. Okay, now we're going to move on to Gust.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. I just wanted to make a quick point about one of the mechanisms that could be in place for cities to use as an enforcement, I guess, resource to what the severity might need to be. And that would be just looking at the credible attempts or approaches that cities have taken to attract housing starts, to reach out to the state for resources, developers for interest level. I think all of that could weigh heavily on whether the city is actually taking this seriously. So that was just it.
Yeah, thank you. I think that, none of this is actually particularly linear. Questions and discussions raised here go then back to audit, or maybe even all the way back to referral. And so one of those questions that raised for me is, how do we get that information in the audit process so that it can feed into the discussions in the acceleration agreement? And so as we come back around in later discussions, and as DLCD is thinking through rulemaking, having gone through all of these steps in the process, I think we'll have a better informed gaze at each of the individual components. Okay, Michael.
On that note, I've been thinking a fair amount about that earlier in the flow chart, the question that Thea framed as deep but narrow versus broad but shallow. And I wonder if there's something here, like if there's a way to get a little bit of the best of both worlds with a broad but shallow set of measures that many cities would be evaluated on, and that like maybe there's some subset of cities that would be given a deeper look at more complicated, less objective work that needs to be done. I wonder if there's like a two-tier system, or like, I don't know how you think about that, but like it seems to me that bears on the question of like, how do we come up with a sufficiently effective acceleration agreements? In some cases, it may be just get your zoning code better in the 6 different ways. And in other cases, it may be like, well, you got to really work with the railroad here.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because once referred, you're on the train all the way to the end, right? So you're going to go through audit, you're going to enter into an acceleration agreement. And so it's some amount of process for in that next 12 months. But to your point is, could it be fairly, not rote, but like more streamlined for that first tier, and a more in-depth process for a deeper tier? And then that comes back again. How do I fall? How do I like, how do I know at the beginning, or do I know at the beginning which tier I'm actually in? And I think that's a trickier question, because the things that we use to refer are more quantitative, as opposed to what happens in the audit once I'm already referred. So when in the process you get divided into the different tiers would be an interesting question. Thea.
Yeah, Cadence, I think that you essentially grabbed my point. So, but I think that, no, I think that that's, it's a really interesting idea, Michael. And I'm thinking, when I'm thinking about it, I guess there's a couple of primary questions for me. One would be like, what would trigger you to go to that deeper level? And that, does go sort of back to the referral question. As Cadence says, it's non-linear, but, and then the other one is really, well, I guess how do you structure these acceleration agreements? Like one, I guess two branches of acceleration agreements, two styles of acceleration agreements, the lighter touch one and the more in-depth one. Are they similar? Are they completely different? I mean, I guess there's a lot to talk about there, but I think I think it would be an interesting approach for sure.
Yeah. And this is
just a quick point on your first question, Thea. I totally agree that's a difficult question. It's not a question you will avoid if there is going to be any deep, narrow, right? It's the same question, right? So like,
yeah, no, we have to figure out those triggers regardless. Right. But is there a particular trigger? I mean, like what leaps to mind is like, is there like a fair housing issue that triggers a deeper dive? Are there certain types of ways in which a city is not upholding their end of the bargain or whatever, that would like launch it into this sort of this deeper level of review? And like I mean, I think fair housing leaps to mind. I think that there's probably others, but right, you would certainly want it to be something that appears more sort of entrenched or intentional. Anyway, hand it back to you guys.
Thank you, Samuel.
Yeah. So in my day-to-day job, I review a lot of housing related PAPAs. And what I have found is that there is so much currently that the numbers don't tell you. They kind of surface on accident, or like one thing appears to be the thing that has come up a lot is when a city downzones. And that automatically, like is going to make me pay closer to attention to that, because we just assume that doesn't seem like something that you would do in the case of a severe housing shortage. And invariably, what the city says is that this is necessary because multifamily is not possible in this area. And that raises the question, well, why was it zoned multifamily in the first place? And so again, with the existing Goal 10 process, it seemed like these cities were on the straight and narrow, that they had a surplus of lands all of this time. And it wasn't until this kind of change happened that anyone paid attention to it. And you realize that there were intentional decisions that should have raised red flags. They were 30 years ago, or more. And so that's what I'm kind of hesitant about with the broad and shallow versus narrow and deep, because a lot of times the more systemic barriers are ones that, if you're not looking deep, they're only going to surface on those rare instances when something pops up like that. So that's just that's what I've experienced, and something to watch out for.
So then would you gravitate towards narrow and deep?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure. I'll put like a cross my T or something. Daisy, please.
Hi. I don't know if I have a fully thought out opinion on narrow and deep versus broad and whatever. But just building on this point around, is there a potential fair housing thing that could trigger a deeper dive? One of the things that I've been thinking about is that the HPS doesn't currently require a city to do any geographic analysis of where they might want to locate or target certain investments that, you know, will produce housing or affordable housing. And one of the things that we're seeing in Portland is that a lot of the affordable housing is going in areas, is being built in areas that are already low income, already have a concentration of, you know, folks of color, immigrants and refugees, and few amenities. And on a, you know, on a market side, it makes sense, right? Because that's where land is cheaper. But if we're seeing a city, for example, put most of their housing investments in a certain area that is already, you know, I'm blanking on the fair housing terminology here, but you know, that where there's already a concentration of poverty or lack of amenities, is that, how does this process kind of take that into account? That to me sounds like somewhere where we might want to do a deeper dive. But yeah, those are my musings for this moment.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. So for example, maybe I'm doing okay on total production. Maybe I'm even doing okay on affordable housing production, but it's all in that part of town, right? And so that might make us take a deeper look, right? And the second question that we had is, when is expedited action necessary? And what that was really trying to get at is, I'm usually referred because I'm at the midpoint of my HPS. Something has gone wrong and I'm lowest performing on some or multiple indicators. I've gone through this audit process. And so one option that DLCD could say is, you are actually mostly doing your HPS. And so just do a better HPS next time, right? Or make sure your HPS identifies these 4 things and we'll see you in 4 years. Or DLCD could say, no. Maybe you were doing the things in your HPS, but it wasn't sufficient. It's obviously not sufficient because of these things. And so the question is, what would be the indicators that would say, no, you don't get to wait another 4 years. Actually, you need to amend your HPS right now. And these are the things that we want you to do. Is it, you know, and so you've listed one, which is, you're concentrating your affordable housing in just a single area, and you're essentially exacerbating areas of poverty instead of ameliorating it. What would be some other kinds of factors that would lead this group to believe that, yeah, actually time is of the essence. There are obvious, maybe not obvious to them, but there are things that we think are clear you need to do now. Oh, Sean.
Can I add something here too? And it's not like we're deciding this in a vacuum. The statute actually says kind of what it is, but there's some discretion in there. Pretty much what the statute says is, if it turns out through the audit process that the factors that are affecting production are, it's like the specific wording, I'm pretty sure, is something like directly a consequence of the policies or practices within a city's control. So it's like there's this direct nexus between what the city is doing, their choices, and the outcomes that you're seeing. That requires DLCD to put them on an expedited time frame. And then if they're not, like if the factors are not that, they essentially can be part of the next HPS cycle. So like we make the recommendations, the city says, all right, well, we'll address this in our next HPS, and we'll, you know, provide findings showing how we've responded to this audit and what we're doing in response to it. And so that distinction is pretty important. So that's why we're trying to get at, what is that line of like, this is clearly something that warrants the expedited piece. This is clearly within that control, that aspect of it. And this part is kind of maybe more nuanced than that. Maybe it doesn't require that kind of expedited time frame for amending the HPS and taking actions within a certain time frame. Just to help clarify that a little bit.
Yeah. And this is important because technically, probably there is always something a city could do more, right? And so the question is, what's the threshold for, yeah, maybe there is a single thing I could do, but it's like way down on the list of possible things versus, no, there are a dozen things that you could and should do. And what are those considerations? What are those actions that we think are pertinent to that determination? Michael?
I'm gonna, before we move on too far, stick up for team Broad Shallow, or at least team Don't Forget Broad Shallow. I think I totally take your point, Sam, but I just want to emphasize that I feel like the trade-off is if we want a meaningful amount of policy change at the state level, then a fairly large number of cities need to see a pinch coming if they don't change policies. And so like that pinch can be different in different situations, and it doesn't have to necessarily be punitive. To Matt's language earlier, like I don't think policy change is necessarily punitive, but anyway, I think that's my point.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll just add. Yeah, this is such an important question that we're asking to rack this, so don't worry.
Yeah. And there is a piece in that, which is some of these changes take time to implement. And so, right, the HPS cycle is, right, 6 or 8 years, depending on where you are in the state. And so I think part of the question is, yes, policy changes need to be made, and they need to be made statewide among all cities, right? We need to continue to evolve how we're producing housing. I think most jurisdictions have recognized that. I think the really pertinent question is, what requires sort of midpoint course correction in an HPS, and why? And maybe it's because, oh, I had a medium good HPS when it got approved, and maybe that will get flushed out of the system as we continue. But are there other things that also might be considerations? Anne?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of what would cause an immediate course correction. I mean, looking at what would refer you into the acceleration program, it's really about that measure of progress, and it's a measure of progress on those 3 issues of production, or at least equitable outcomes, 2 issues. And I mean, I feel like, if you had a mediocre HPS, and you might be making some progress, and again, it's proportionate to maybe where your starting point was, your city and size and number of affordable housing units, and what your HPS said the need was, or the HNA said the need was, and what you're doing in HPS. But I feel like some of the strategies are it's sort of like an audit of the HPS. I mean, is there a way that and I put this on a sticky note when I figured out how to do the sticky note, have a report that starts listing out the kinds of things that we'd be measuring to determine housing production and proportionality, and then what kinds of things might result in more equitable outcomes. Because I'm thinking about the really good example in Portland that Daisy brought up, that let's just say all affordable housing is going into one area. Well, is that because that's the only place where there's available land? Or, I mean, the city of Albany doesn't actually currently have a pot of money to incentivize housing, period, right? But let's just say we did. we have to have applicants come to us with applications. Maybe we could score them better, but I'm thinking if there were steps in our HPS that talked about these things that I've just mentioned, do we have enough land zoned in these areas to distribute if we have a recap issue, right? And then what are we doing as a city to address, these deficiencies? If those aren't in our HPS, maybe that's a flag where that technical assistance it's right for technical assistance. Maybe you're not in trouble, but what could we do? Maybe you need to booster your HPS or update your APS a little bit sooner. I feel like there has to be a way in the reporting process for there to be some similarity in reporting from jurisdictions so that you can also evaluate jurisdictions against each other or against cities of a similar size or proportionately, so that then you could figure out, well, wow, yeah, this is really deficient, and there's maybe a way you can draw that threshold line, and it's causing you to really expedite that process. I don't know.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, Samuel.
Yeah, this is going to be a real obvious one, but I just want to get it on the record. Are the cities following the timelines of the strategies laid out in the HPS? I mean, I think that we're going to have plenty of instances of cities that are going to have excuses like, because of the political environment, we weren't able to get this passed like we wanted, or in this time frame, or we didn't have a specific, super specific time frame in the HPS, and now we've blown through that. I think that's going to come up a lot. So if they're not sticking to the timeline laid out in the HPS, that is probably something that should cause more immediate referral.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Matt.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of or imagine, who is going to get referred. And I think a lot of this discussion really takes me back to the importance of the referral process in the beginning. Because either everybody is going to be in the housing acceleration program statewide, which I don't think is the intent of the legislation, and I don't think is feasible. Or, we're actually going to have jurisdictions who either need help or don't know that they need help to address real problems. And so on this issue of, broad and shallow versus deep and narrow, I think that by the time you get referred, we're looking at doing like a pretty in-depth kind of analysis. I mean, and this goes back to the conversation that we had last time on the referral process. I think Anne brought up the point, which is actually in that flow chart. It's in the law. If you haven't adopted an HPS, then you have problems, just immediately. But for everybody else, I think once you get referred, you're really at the point where you're sort of subject to a much more in-depth look at things. And to my mind, that's probably a better use of resources, because I think it's going to be really complicated. It's not going to be as simple as, jurisdiction X doesn't want poor people living in a place where rich people live. I think it's going to be a lot more nuanced than that. And something that, as we're talking about this whole subject, we need to remind ourselves, and there might be some exceptions here, but we don't build the housing. We're, as Anne was saying earlier, we're really subject to the market and to the ability and the willingness of our partners in the not-for-profit and for-profit affordable housing and other development sectors to actually build the stuff. So I think that whole discussion is going to be pretty complex, and is going to take time. And so I think it tends toward that deeper kind of conversation about the challenges that jurisdictions are facing. Not to rain on Michael's broad but shallow. But I think by the time you get to this point, you're looking at a pretty complicated kind of conversation and analysis.
So Matt's team narrow and deep.
Yeah, and I really want to get in. So I understand. I think these are all very good points. I'm going to pull the TAC card to say that we have some specific questions that are not really related to the broad, narrow, shallow, deep. That's like rulemaking advisory committee, policy question. We're going to be asking that next week. Get in your comments to us. We want to hear them. We think you guys have great takes, but we do want to focus a little bit more specifically on these questions rather than getting into that policy discussion.
And
so
we're going to bring that
play
back. And we're going to bring that back to you, what they say, and that can help us sort of frame out that next step. So
we'll bring it back. We'll start talking details, but let's get back to the acceleration agreement.
So to that end, right? Either we've gone broad and deep, or we've been broad and shallow, narrow or deep, and we have gotten through the audit. We're at the acceleration process, and I think actually, as we're talking about these issues, we might be labeling them about how we want the initial examination to go, but really we are also talking about then what do we do about it, right? And I think that's where we are now. And so one of the questions that is pretty interesting to me is, what if it's not within the city's control, right? So we could argue, and maybe we should, all day long about what's in a city's control. And even though you're not building affordable housing, there are a lot of actions that many cities take, whether it's money, relationship building, zoning, or whatever, that help foster an environment where affordable housing can be built. But say that that's not the case. Say that we are in a situation where there is a barrier to production or equitable outcomes. We've touched on this a little bit, but what are the things that the acceleration agreement should include? Should it include a convening of ODOT and DLCD in the jurisdiction to get the transportation infrastructure improvement? Should it be some other kind of actions that DLCD could at least encourage its sister agencies to participate in? Should it just be a recitation of the things that are outside the city's control that DLCD finds and the city agrees are impacting the city's ability to foster affordable housing or housing production or equitable outcomes? These are the kinds of considerations, questions, and aspects that we'd like to hear from you that you think are important, essentially to be codified in tandem with those actions that the city will take, in tandem with the actions that DLCD will take. There's this third bucket of things, and we want to know how those should be considered. Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you for reframing the question, Cadence. I think it is very important that if a jurisdiction is having difficulty meeting their targets, that OHCS, DLCD, DEQ, DSL, that they're all together in the room looking at how their agency could assist. It may mean that DEQ needs to look at a wetland plan, as Anne noted. It may be that the 1200C procedures are delaying projects, and maybe they need to look at that and provide more guidance on it, or more staff. For some projects in Cornelius that are on an ODOT facility, it's been taking 2 years to get through the right-of-way permit process. That is not acceptable. That takes too long for a simple right-of-way. So convening all these sister agencies, I think, is really important, and hearing from the local jurisdictions about what is holding up production. It may not be the local jurisdiction, it may be the state agency, and it may be some of the actions that the local government is taking, but really take a comprehensive look at everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for that. One other question is, does DLCD have a role in helping to convene affordable housing developers to areas where they're not currently located or active? Do jurisdictions want or need help sort of enticing, right, developers who are going to produce the kind of housing that the jurisdiction needs? And is there a role for DLCD in that? Sam?
It's,
Oh.
I didn't have.
I was just gonna say, I mean, it even without a direct convening, it's certainly creating the data for a darn good pitch to developers. I would also say to federal agencies who are, doling out grant dollars to overcome some of these issues. I think that the audit process and the acceleration process probably has a really good, it's going to be a really good tool for filtering the variety of issues in order to pick out which ones can be overcome by whom. And then, yes, DLCD should be a strong advocate for cities when it comes to addressing those.
Right. Thank you. Daisy.
Thank you. I think that's a really great idea. My question is, why not have OHCS kind of, OHCS already has these existing relationships with a lot of developers, especially affordable developers. Why not let HCS, who already has that kind of knowledge and expertise when it comes to development, kind of lead that and not, have DLCD staff kind of form new relationships.
Yeah. Smart. Yeah. Matt. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I agree with what Daisy is saying about kind of using the existing infrastructure of relationships that various state agencies have with affordable housing producers. But DLCD, can play that convening role, perhaps. And I don't know what DLCD's LCDC's authorities are over other state agencies. I don't know if you can issue enforcement orders against ODOT, DSL. That might come in handy sometimes. I doubt that that's actually legal, but at least, again, you can bring the stakeholders who need to be in the same room together. And I think that can be useful. And this is, kind of an urban rural issue, I think, because you have a lot of affordable housing developers in the metro area, and not so much out, where we are. So, our second community land trust here in the Rogue Valley is going to be proud ground out of Portland. So, and there's only one other kind of down in this area. So my guess is that the further east you go or the further west you go out to the coast, the more pronounced that issue is. And so that kind of capacity building, I think, is something that's really important and something that DLCD could do in this case.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really interesting question about how does DLCD spend its technical assistance money, right? And on whom, and right. So every acceleration agreement comes with some TA and also resources. And it may be very much so that the local jurisdiction is the entity that needs the TA and the resources. Over time, maybe that won't necessarily be the case. Maybe there are other partners or parts of the system that need that assistance as well. Michael.
I guess I am generally skeptical of chant times when a government agency takes it on itself to do something that all the private actors involved already have an incentive to do. and that my impression would be that DLCD's time is best spent keeping its focus on the jurisdictions and helping the jurisdictions. I think Daisy's point about OHCS having existing relationships makes a lot of sense, but yeah, that's it. I can imagine a world in which there is a convening, like Matt mentions, that's useful. I wonder if DLCD were to be involved in something like that, maybe something that would be closer to its wheelhouse is giving some sort of a status to certain cities that DLCD thinks they're doing a great job, and then the city can brag about that to the developer. I feel like there are a lot of there's so much like woo-woo vibes judgment on the part of developers of like, what are the chances that my project is going to be in trouble politically, that some effort by DLCD to standardize a system that would, without any further work by DLCD, create a tool to communicate how pro housing a city is might be useful. Not sure.
Matt.
That's an interesting concept. I mean, we do that with economic development and development ready sites for, traded sector industry, for example. So that's an interesting idea. And, it does get to this issue of how we use the Housing Acceleration Program to guide or influence the investment of state resources in housing. Obviously we want to be able to support communities that are underperforming, but on the other hand, then you the way things end up with when funding is so tight that you end up penalizing communities that have worked really hard to make it easy to do housing. Or at least that's the feeling that I have sometimes looking at it from this side of things, where we have good projects, and they go through 2 cycles of lift funding and don't get funded. And that actually brings me to another point, which is part of that TA. This has kind of been touched on a little bit before, but a little technical assistance to help our housing developers be more competitive and put forward more competitive, more compelling applications to OHCS for LIFT, LIHTC, whenever we actually get more funding like that. So,
thank you. Anne.
Yeah, I mean, kind of building on what some others said, I think if DLCD is able to collect the things that we have control over, which is, regulatory changes in our development code, zoning, this and that, best practices. I know there's a menu of all the things that might work or not work in our cities, but I mean, if we were able to collect some success stories through this reporting, I know that one size doesn't fit all in each city, but if DLCD is sort of the clearinghouse for some success stories and helping match cities up with other cities that have done something, or, be our advocate, even at public hearings or whatever, hey, sorry, but, you guys really have to do this. It might be helpful. I mean, we can research what other cities are doing, but we don't necessarily get all the details. And I think that, if there was some reporting of success using different tools without it being too cumbersome, it might be helpful to share those resources back out, or especially with the cities that may need it. And, I when Matt spoke before, I mean, I agree with everything that Matt said before, but I think that we need to, when we're thinking about the level of support that we're going to give folks that are in that are moving towards acceleration agreements, I think that'd be really helpful, and I don't know, the deeper or fewer, I might want to get into the acceleration program, but especially if it's helpful, because we need money and we need support. And singing about the timeline, not meeting your timelines in your HPS, well, it is really challenging when you have very few limited staff. You can be working through your list, and you try to be realistic when you're setting up your timelines, but we might just need that additional help and support. And maybe we can do that outside of the acceleration program if we can share some of these resources and success stories. But that could be a role that DLCD plays in the acceleration agreement.
Yeah. So, Anne, if you were referred and you go through your audit and you can essentially show, I am trying, here are the actions we've taken. What I really need is capacity. And so an acceleration agreement came with technical assistance or resources for you to get the capacity. That would be a good outcome for you. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, I think you said it really well. I also think in that reporting before you're referred in, you might have an opportunity to identify some of the reasons why or where you are, and maybe if you're not meeting your timelines and your HPS or your production targets, you have a chance to explain why and start identifying what you think might be helpful in addressing or moving you along in some of those strategies that you had. So I don't know, be helpful.
Yeah, that seems logical to me.
Well,
Go
and I'll even add, just from an implementation perspective, we have a place to do it, which is the midpoint report, right? Like right now, that's essentially just a progress report that cities develop at the midpoint of the HPS to say, how are things going? That could be, I mean, that's almost intended for that explicit purpose to be like, yeah, we're really struggling with capacity issues. Like we haven't been able to hire, these planners, and that has made implementation of these policies really difficult. And so that could be a really good starting point for that discussion.
Well, and that's even though we haven't had to do an HPS yet, we're not going to get referred, but ours isn't due till 2028 or something like that. But I think that if you had a little bit of a framework around what that report said, so that you're also looking at the different, measures in 197.130, that how are you doing in addressing these things through your HPS, even though jurisdictions might have adopted their HPS before this came into law. Let's just see how they're comparing and measuring to these new standards that might put you into the referral, so that they're not just reporting only on whatever they decide they want to report on, that there's some structure and a little bit of consistency if possible around whether they're addressing some of the issues and requirements that might then be something that would require them to be referred if they're not making progress in the 197.8.132 stuff or whatever. So
yeah, this self-reporting is going to be really critical. It doesn't matter which part of the process, and the information from the jurisdiction and self-reflection on how y'all are doing and why will be so important to the entire process being successful. So let's take a step back. We've entered into the acceleration. The audit is done. We're in the 6-month period where the acceleration agreement needs to be negotiated, either as part of the audit or at the beginning of the acceleration process. The DLCD has found that there are some barriers to production or affordable housing or equitable outcomes that are within the city's control. And so now you're in this place where you're going to need to amend your HPS. And now we're talking about what are the things that you are going to do. And it may be many. It may be you're going to use technical assistance or resources from DLCD to hire another planner so that you can accelerate different specific amendments. But in the statute, there are 5 or 6 things that the list could include that DLCD could require you all to do and cities to do. And one is dedicate funds for increased local capacity to facilitate housing production and affordability and choice, dedicating funds for public facilities and infrastructure that would support the necessary housing production, taking measures to increase availability of development-ready land, amending your development code, approval criteria, procedures, or reducing the cost or delay to housing production. And then finally, taking emergency temporary measures to support housing production. So the Thea talked about those earlier, and when she was outlining the requirements of the statute, the question is, I mean, let's just chunk it, right? The first two talk about dedicating local funds towards those actions that will support housing production. When should that come into play? How does DLCD operationalize that? And when? When should cities be required to spend more money on housing or things that help produce housing? It's a big deal, this power. Matt.
So this is one that I think is kind of problematic. I think about how this actually works in the real world with budgetary authority for local jurisdictions. You know, yeah, I really, I don't know how this actually happens. I think DLCD can make recommendations. I mean, I think you can put this into the agreement, but I don't think you can compel a city council to make budgetary decisions about how they're going to allocate various funding. And that goes for other kinds of incentives that don't have as obvious a fiscal impact as something like, you know, directly allocating $5 million to build, you know, a new stormwater collection treatment system, something like that, that would support housing development. Multiple unit property tax exemption programs, for example. You know, you might have a city that wants to do that, and they enter into that's part of the agreement with DLCD. But the impact of that particular program is contingent upon whether or not the city can convince 51% of the taxing jurisdictions or 51% of the millage, you know, in that area to participate. You know, and not to throw any shade on Jackson County, but if it weren't for the school district, we never would have gotten our MUPD program passed with the full millage. And that affects what that incentive means for housing development. So, you know, we can say these things and put them into an acceleration agreement, but how that actually ends up playing out when it comes to the commitment of financial resources, I think is another question. And, you know, and then you get into a situation where, you know, you penalize a community that needs the resources from being able to receive them through other sources. So in other words, you know, if we say this jurisdiction's doing a bad job, so OHCS don't award any LIFT funds to projects within this jurisdiction, that makes absolutely no sense. So I really don't know how you operationalize this. It seems to me at best it's largely symbolic, because if you say we're not going to direct other state resources, we're not going to provide technical assistance if you're being bad, then we sort of defeat the whole purpose of part of this program.
Yeah.
Can I make a couple of statutory clarifications with that, Matt? Totally agree with you. I should mention the statute does not, first on the acceleration agreement itself, we would not say like OHCS don't provide LIFT funding to this jurisdiction. That doesn't make any sense. And then also, even if we get to the point of like an LCDC issued enforcement order, there's one tool in there that's about like shared revenue withholding, which is this kind of existing provision in LCDC. Essentially, it enables us to say you can withhold this and use that funding to come into compliance, like to spend these resources essentially for that city to work on coming back into compliance. It's always structured around making that pathway easy to compliance and not around just withholding resources as a punishment to XYZ jurisdiction. That's kind of counterintuitive to what the goal is. So I think that's an important clarification, because yes, I agree with you. I think it's also reflected in the statute.
Yeah. Agreed. And then the third point, Matt, is you're right. There's no compelling, right? The idea of the acceleration agreement is that it is a two-party agreement. So the jurisdiction and DLCD agree that this will be so. The question though is, what if they do not come to agreement? And then what does DLCD do about it? And so I think part of the question is, when should DLCD stick to its guns, so to speak, and say, city, we think it's really important, sorry, Anne, that you hire a second planner to augment your capacity, or whatever that case may be, which would create a financial impact on the jurisdiction. And that's sort of the question that we're trying to mull over here. Ariel, I assume you've got some thoughts about this one.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry, my camera's not working today. I guess so. I had some thoughts, but on what you just said, hey, DLC says, hey, city, we think you need to hire a second planner. Is that then? I mean, is that binding? Is that directive? What comes to your question? What happens if the city disagrees? Because I agree with Matt. I don't think the authority is there. And I appreciated some of the ideas. I think last time that we talked about this, I think it was Tom that said, hey, is there a way to compare like similarly sized cities, for example, and to say, maybe this is what you ought to look at when you're considering what the appropriate size of your planning staff is. I pointed out a flaw in that, similar sized cities don't always have similar revenue capacities. And I think that's just indicative of like, there's always going to be a situation like that, and calls into question the appropriateness, let alone the legality of the state saying, city, you should be expending your resources in X way. I just think fundamentally that's not appropriate or legal. But yeah, I guess my question to you is like, is that what the rule is going to say, or what you think the direction is in terms of, I think it's a conversation we have. I think it's an appropriate conversation for DLCD and the city to have in the context of their HPS, but have we defined, or is it clear for this group what that actual enforcement ability is when it comes to revenue and financial resources?
So there's so much to unpack there. Let me start, and then Sean and Thea, please also feel free to clarify or jump in. So to be absolutely clear, the acceleration agreement is a bilateral agreement between the city and DLCD. So there's no kind of unilateral in this part of the process where DLCD just says, full stop, city, you must. That said, the statute does say, if DLCD determines that there are barriers that exist to housing production, choice, or affordability that are within the city's control, the acceleration agreement can include these things, right? And those things include dedicating local resources towards housing production and taking emergency measures, et cetera, et cetera. So now the question will be, will the city agree to those measures that DLCD puts forth? That's within their control. One assumes that if the city does agree to do that, they're in a contractual agreement, I guess, with DLCD that they will do those things. And so there would be a timeline under which they would make those changes. That's the piece for the acceleration agreement. The natural question becomes, if DLCD puts that on the table and the city doesn't pick up what DLCD is putting down, and you are unable to otherwise negotiate an acceleration agreement, then what happens after that? And then I think under statute, what happens after that is DLCD has the discretion to pursue an enforcement order, and whether that is approved or not is another matter. But that's, as I understand it, the sequence of things.
Yeah, then I guess thank you. I guess my position is still then that when it comes to financial resources, I don't think DLCD has the authority to initiate enforcement based on a city's decision whether or not to pursue that. I think it's going to be very much in the eye of the beholder, also whether, what is or isn't in a city's control, and when it comes to property tax revenues and compression limitations and all those kinds of things. I also think this has the potential to create a lot of conflicts. And there are going to be cities who are going to really bristle at that and question DLCD's expertise or understanding of their local revenue and staff capacity and all of that. And I frankly question it. I don't think that necessarily, is there. So I don't know. I just think this is a really difficult thing that we've got to be really clear about what the authority really is or isn't.
Yeah, I hear you on that, Ariel. And so I think one of the questions that comes to my mind is, if I'm a city that has dedicated local resources to creating additional production and affordable housing development, and I am working towards ensuring that our community members have equitable outcomes, and I am part of a larger ecosystem where my sister cities may or may not be taking sort of proportionately similar steps because they're making other choices. How does that work out in a statewide system of housing? What do we do about that? It's like the fair share question.
Yeah.
How do we make sure, or do we make sure that jurisdictions do their fair share? And what are the steps that DLCD should take in order to make that so?
Yeah, I don't know that I have the answer right now. I do know that there are going to be like on the ground characteristics that are going to influence that in every region, that are not going to be within any city's control. And it is what it is kind of a thing in terms of, I think I gave the example of like Gresham with some of the lowest property tax base, even though it's one of the largest cities and it's a metro partner, all those kinds of things. So, I think there are important regional conversations to have. And I don't know if this is kind of outside the scope of this particular question and discussion, but like how those regional conversations can be facilitated and supported by DLCD as cities are doing their HPS, what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Samuel.
Yeah, this is separate and apart from, funding, but I do think a lot about the needed housing statute and the unreasonable cost and delay. I think that this is probably through the acceleration agreement. There are probably procedures that would be standards, conditions, and procedures regulating the development of housing, which is what the statute says, that would be identified as causing unreasonable cost and delay in needed housing. And so, again, this is separate and apart from funding, but I do think that there's the potential to force some reforms to those procedures.
At a local level.
Yeah.
Ariel.
Yeah, that just made me think, thanks, Sam, for that. I mean, I think when it comes to like the funding specifically, when Sam said needed housing, I mean, we are going to have objective numbers that cities are trying to reach. And so I think maybe I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud, but maybe it's a matter of DLCD not, they're not going to be able to say, should I stop?
No, I don't know how that happened. Ingrid, can you resume the?
I think someone dropped off, maybe lost connection. So I don't think that DLCs can say, based on my understanding, can say you have to, you have to pass this levy, or you have to you need to spend more money here, or you have this money, even if you're telling us you don't. I don't think that's a productive line, but they can say you need to meet this need, and here are the things you've been trying, and you've got to consider these other things. And so maybe it's just a little bit more open-ended, but I don't know, it's just hard because at a certain point there is, with ONA DLC is supposed to provide some prescriptive remedies if a city doesn't take them themselves. I just think we've got to get some clarity on the role here on the local control around things that are not specifically land use related or under Goal 10.
Well, and it really is important to figure out, right? Because there's only so much that a zoning code can do, especially when you're thinking about housing choice, right? There are so many affirmative actions that are required to make sure that we have accessible, available housing for our community members, that for sure, like we can do equity audits of zoning codes. So I'm not saying there's nothing that can be done in that regard, but there are so many other actions that require usually time and money on the local jurisdiction side. And so what do we do if they are not dedicating time and money And how do we help them if they don't have time or money? Yeah, Anne.
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at how do you allocate funds for public facilities and infrastructure when, I mean, really there's an SEC program that collects funds for oversizing and infrastructure. And I know the planning department doesn't really have much say over, a 5-year CIP from the Public Works, or the TSPs aren't done frequently enough. You've got project lists and different facility plans that are based on the best guess of what we need. But I mean, then the SEC funded projects are usually outlined in those. I mean, that's really something that would be very challenging to control. And then, I mean, I'm just thinking about Albany. We are still getting ready to have the conversation about whether we want to adopt a CET. Looks like we'll be moving forward with a MUPD. But if we don't have a CET, we really don't have a source available to actually support housing production, a financial support. And so, because it says specifically allocating funds, and I mean, we can do all the other tools in our zoning, and trying to support nonprofits to please come here and hopefully get lift money or whatever. But I mean, we may not physically be able to allocate funds, or it may take us a really long time to build up enough in a pot of money that even if we have adopted a CET, or with our MUPD, we're going to give them the option to pay a fee in lieu of, I just feel like we may not physically be able to do either of those funding things. And I'm just using us as an example city.
Yeah.
We'll do everything else that we can, but funding could be a really big challenge beyond the budget and the council and budgeting authority.
Yeah, I hear that very clearly and can appreciate the difficulty. And so taking just for a minute, pursuing that example, as a planner, you don't have control of the CIP or the TSP. It would be an interesting question to explore of if the lack of a transportation improvement or some other capital investment was pretty clearly the reason why a certain portion of property was not unlocked, would it be reasonable for DLCD to ask the city to agree to update its CIP or TSP to accelerate those improvements, to essentially mitigate those barriers more quickly? Not saying they have to mandate it, right? Because still, it's always it's a bilateral agreement. The city would have to agree. But do you think that would be a reasonable request?
Well, we are going to have to be amending our TSP to address prioritized projects in climate-friendly areas, right? Well, climate-friendly areas may not be where affordable housing is, although it may be where we want housing to be, but depending on what the targets are and all that. I mean, and with infrastructure, the costs of, sewer systems and water systems and all of that, I mean, it's hard to get millions of dollars additional to reprioritize projects, or even just to raise enough SCC revenues to get the project funded, even if you moved it up the list. I mean, I don't know, but I think if it's a conversation where the cities and DLCD are in conversation about what could the city look at, and that we're at least trying, I feel like we should get credit for that. I don't know. I mean, we try to work really closely with Public Works and everything, but it's, there could be a lot of needs in a city, I hear a lot of cities have really old pipes. Well, how do you prioritize that? Fixing an existing community, I mean, some things aren't SCC eligible, but I think it's really complicating. And I don't know that I think as long as there's a conversation and not a requirement, that I think that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, thank you. Gust.
Thank you. I just wanted to agree with Ariel in that I think there's obvious backlash coming, but I think that we can offset the level of that by having clear and defined kind of action items, if you will. If you're not doing this, if you're not doing these three things, you should expect a bit heavier hand. So I just, and I'm not sure what those three things are. I'm hoping we're getting close to identifying those, or however many we need. But I think that's one thing that I would definitely think we would want to have clearly identified. And then I just had two examples. We talked a lot about rural and urban. I just left the Habitat for Humanity Oregon conference on the coast, and I was kind of smiling because on one of the slides they put up, they have one Habitat for Humanity affiliate on the east side of the state, and the other 36 are on the west side, or however many there are. I think there might be more than that, but it was just kind of a stark recognition for east and west, and the difficulties in doing simple things on the east side and the west side. And then I was also at a conference last week where the urban renewal director, I got a chance to meet him through someone from Pendleton. And after the meeting, the next day, I get a very blunt email from him just saying, we want you to be considering developing in Pendleton. Now, to me, that's being very proactive and trying to be resourceful for your community. I can't say that that's happened often, but it does happen, right? So trying to find ways to help cities that are struggling be resourceful is another thing that I think would be helpful. And if they're not able to find that themselves, maybe as part of the enforcement, DLCD comes in and spends some of their money to help them with ways that we know have been proven to be resourceful. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, Michael.
Few scattered thoughts. I think there's a principle in the military command that you're not supposed to issue an offer that your people won't follow. You're not supposed to issue an order that your people won't follow. I wonder if that's something that would inform the state's decisions about like what it can expect if it ultimately lacks the authority to force something to happen. Then maybe that should not be something that it pretends to require prior to that happening. I don't know what that list is, and we've had some discussion about it right now. But that's not to say, though, that you could not create as a safe harbor something that the state can't force. Right. But yeah, another, I want to echo Sam's point about unreasonable cost and delay. Good point on this problem. And this is sort of off the wall, but like I've mentioned before, one of my qualms about the statute in the first place is that it doesn't do anything to recognize the role of housing choice vouchers, our single largest form of public affordable housing. And I wonder if there's anything that can be done in this set of best practices that cities could do in the absence of their own funding to tap that massive pool of funding that is potentially available for affordable housing. I don't know. Obviously, it can't be seen by the methodology, and so it can't pay off in some ways, but as a practical matter, is an important way to house people.
So maybe that's part of the convening power, is to encourage some more conversation among housing authorities and local jurisdictions to see. We've also talked a little bit about the regional convening and what does that look like? How does a region apportion vouchers, but also resources? Okay, Matt.
So as we're talking about the urgency with which solutions are kind of reacting to the problem, to these deficiencies, I think it's important to keep in mind that any of these sort of economic incentives, economic supports that facilitate housing production are going to be like longer term, are going to be a little bit longer term, unless it's like an immediate thing where there's like a piece of a sanitary sewer that needs to be replaced, and a development just can't afford to do it, and that's a different sort of situation. But if we're talking about updating TSPs, updating sanitary sewer master plans, those are 2-year long processes in and of themselves that are expensive, and then don't even get at the overall issue of alleviating a more immediate housing needs. So I think that's something just to keep in mind. If investments in infrastructure, economic incentives for housing production are things that jurisdictions can do to address a deficiency, and that's something that DLCD looks favorably upon as a way to address whatever has been discovered in that audit, then that's something I think that we should be able to offer if we're able to do that. But it is I think it is really challenging to sort of say that that's a quick fix to sort of housing underproduction. It's a years long sort of thing, and I think also in this whole conversation, there are kind of two situations that we're looking at. I think we're looking at jurisdictions where maybe they're doing things that are very immediate within their control, or not doing things like zoning land, denying applications, making it difficult to do housing development in the near term. And then there's the situation where we have communities that, for whatever reason, probably lack of resources more than anything else, aren't able to plan out, the future development of their communities such that it supports the provision of different kinds of housing that are able to accommodate all of these different needs that we have within our communities. And those are two really different situations, and probably need very different kinds of approaches to them.
Thank you for that. So now maybe we should segue to the last question on our list, which is, should DLCD identify a list of tools or actions that respond to specific barriers and use those as the basis of an acceleration agreement? Should cities essentially know in advance, if your HPS does not include, or it does include, but you haven't done it yet, these actions, know that they're going to be first on the list when DLCD comes to the table? And if there is a list like that, do you have ideas about what should be on the list? Sort of like best practices that cities should be cognizant of as they're thinking about production, affordability, and choice. And should that be codified in rules, or do you think that that's guidance? Do you think where do you think that should show up in the process? I'll start with an example. And Matt, you brought up the MUPD, right? So what about the nonprofit affordable housing tax exemption? That still requires other taxing jurisdictions to opt in or opt out, one of the two. And so if I'm a jurisdiction and I have not pursued it, and also I'm falling behind in affordable housing production, should I just know, and how should I know that that's one of the things that might be on the list? And would it be helpful to jurisdictions to know that list in advance? Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think the list is a good idea. This is something that before we had a housing production strategy, we looked at as we were developing our housing program. And at the time, there really wasn't a lot of guidance, and having a list, I think, was helpful. Obviously, not all the solutions are going to match up with individual communities, but it's a good place to start. And that's something that I think, like, as a state, as planners across the state, we maybe don't do a good enough job of, and that's just sharing successes among each other. So, like, it shouldn't be as difficult as me having to, call up the community development director at the city of Tigard, and every time we're developing a new program, a new policy area, and ask, well, So how did this work out for you? I mean, it should be a little bit easier than that. And I think that that's something that DLCD can do. And in fact, when we have a regional plan here that we did with regional problem solving, and housing was one of the things that we had to address. And early on, we did have a list from DLCD that maybe our local rep or somebody else, I forget who developed this, but we did have a list of things that we could kind of look at as we're assessing our own performance in addressing the housing goals that were established in our regional plan. So from my own experience, that is a helpful thing to have, provided that everybody understands, you have to be able to adjust those programs and policies to fit the needs of individual communities.
Yeah, thank you. Anne.
I would agree in that. I think the list would be helpful as long as it can be adjusted or there are enough choices on the list to, because some cities may have already considered a lot of those strategies and they didn't select them because they weren't, for whatever reason. So I think as long as the list is comprehensive, but also tested, that it isn't just something that was pulled out of a document that we saw and was working in Pennsylvania or whatever, that it is something that actually works. I think that would be good. And I just wanted to ask a question because I haven't had to do my HPS yet, but I know when we did our H&A last time, we were only allowed to factor in for middle housing at 3% of our regular in our single family neighborhoods. And we're starting to see subdivisions in middle housing. And I mean, I'm just thinking about the statute part. And what I was really going to say is accessible housing. Well, so the OSSC, the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, it only requires 2% of units to be accessible when you have a complex of 20 or more units. And so something like that, I mean, we know that we have if that's one of our needed housing types and we have an aging population, I think there are some things that we could look at considering for, changes to state law. And I'm thinking about accessibility. I mean, we're trying to figure out how to incentivize more accessible units, or do we require more than what the law does? But I know that it seems to be a little easier, even though some folks don't like it. If the law says we have to do something, it makes it easier for us to actually have to change our code to address those needs. And we swallow the pill, and once that's done, we've moved on. So maybe we might be able to help identify some of those as we collectively think through, are these things that could be on a policy agenda related to needed housing types?
Yeah, I really hear the like plethora of facts that might might rise to the top that may not be able to be actionable in an individual acceleration agreement, but it's really fantastic data for the governor and the legislature to grapple with, and of course sister state agencies as they go through their kind of own mission-based day-to-day, understanding how that intersects with housing production is a big deal and one of the boons, I think, of this process. Yeah, Samuel.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine this having a lot of interplay with the model codes that are generated by HAPO or something like that. And similar to how middle housing worked, you have the model codes, and then if you're in the acceleration program and you're considering the same question, you could go with the model code, or you could do something, reasonably equivalent, the same way that that middle housing worked out. And so, yeah, I think that the model code is both the questions that, it shows what DLCD's priorities are, but it also shows the potential answer. And then the city will have something to go off of to answer those questions.
Yeah. So do you have some examples of where you think model code would be particularly helpful? Anybody? I mean, not just to put you, Samuel, on the spot.
I mean, clearly with accessibility, I would say. No? Tom says no.
No, Ann was right. It's a state building code issue. It's not a land use issue. Accessibility is
Right, but-
capped. We can't do anything because BCD
Oh,
says you
sorry.
can't exceed the code. All we can do is offer a density bonus.
You're right. Not a model zoning code would not do that job. A model building plan would do that job. I apologize.
Well, no, it's not even a plan, it's a building code. BCD
Right.
has to
Yeah,
change the rule to allow us to require more.
Mm.
And everything, and that's where we need DLCD and OHCS to say, BCD, change the rules.
Right.
Because all of our forecasts say we're having an aging population and we need more, zero step entry housing. That's a pretty straightforward issue that is not in local control.
Right. So to reframe that a little bit, Tom, given DLCD has some power, but not all the power, right? Convene BCD to talk about the problems that are involved with not allowing local control over how much accessible housing that you are able to require. And it's interesting because, if the sister agency shows up or not is not something that DLCD can control, but it is an interesting reflection on the division, right? And so at some point, somebody might take notice who does have more control. Yeah. Matt?
And even, I should add, even with all of that in mind, right? Like there is this relationship that DLCD has with Building Codes Division through this Housing Acceleration Production Office. And there's this relationship that's going to be established that never really existed before, right? And that, obviously there's these considerations around the specific provisions that might be at BCD, but there's also other things like how we design model codes to encourage accessibility, how we design ready build plans. Like we can design those to exceed accessibility standards, and they're also easier to build, right? Because you don't have to pay for pre-development costs. So like we have options that are more than just like, can we require it or not require it? And I think there's also this avenue for additional like conversation and nexus between these two agencies that hopefully in this process we can kind of leverage, right? But no, it's a good point. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
That's where I was trying to go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think accessibility is something that the Housing Production Advisory Council recommended. That's one of the recommendations, was to increase it. I forget to how much, probably not enough, but still that's a recommendation that they've made. So hopefully that's one of the things that kind of moves forward there. For model codes, I mean, I think one of the easiest things to do before you get into, design development standards, which can be kind of, which can get controversial at the local level. I think the low-hanging fruit is probably process stuff, and that makes a big difference. You can move as many land use entitlements for housing from quasi-judicial to administrative ministerial processes as you can. That's something that could be in a model code and might be useful. And I think it's something where, the larger jurisdictions are already moving in that direction, have moved in that direction, but smaller jurisdictions haven't, because it's code work that somebody has to do. And unless they get technical assistance, it's just not going to get done. And so, you've got partitions going to planning commission. And, my experience is that planning commission probably doesn't even want to see that. And increasingly with housing, they don't want to see, any commissions don't want to see any housing stuff because it's all clear and objective. And they kind of, they have to show up for a meeting where they feel like they're just rubber stamping an application, hopefully. So that'd be one of those areas. And then there's probably some best practices for site and development standards as well, just to take the work, off of those local jurisdictions.
Yeah. Sean?
And if I could just build on this too, so one of the things that we've actually heard that in particular, especially this dynamic for it being pretty difficult for smaller cities. And so one of the pieces that, that had passed out of the legislature that kind of spoke to this issue was Senate Bill 1564, which has some direction to DLCD to develop some model codes for different size cities, and to enable those cities, if they want to adopt a module by reference. So like if we develop, say, a set of cottage cluster standards for a city below 25,000, and they decide that they really like cottage clusters, they can just be like, well, we're just going to adopt this like off the shelf and apply it, the module, without having to undergo a full code amendment process. And that can include these types of like procedure elements, right? So that way a city doesn't have to kind of constantly update their code in order to be kind of with the best practice. Like DLCD has these ready to go. And actually that's part of our job in this process. So something we've kind of conveyed earlier in this was that, you know, we have this process that we have to develop the rules around, and we should focus on that, right? Because we only have until January 1st of 2025. The next year, we have a lot more time, and we can consider, getting essentially a group together to kind of be like, hey, let's design some good codes, some good procedures, start thinking about ready build plans and try to get these moving forward and to provide these tools for cities. So I think this is all just very exciting, and I just, thank you guys for reflecting that back. So.
Thanks, Sean, for bringing that up. I do think it's important to be in your bonnet about, that opportunity to get involved with the development of model codes, which will, I think be a really effective tool and can be, if we design it right. And we'd love to have all of your, expertise and input in that process. So stay tuned for that and start thinking about, the good ideas.
Yeah, not one, but many processes you can be involved in the Zoomscape. You're so fortunate. So I want to leave a little bit of space for any last thoughts, questions, or comments before we start talking about next steps. Anybody have something that you'd like to offer before we move on to the next agenda item? Okay. Well, so next steps. As I mentioned at the top of the meeting, on April 30th, there will be a RAC meeting, so a meeting of the Policy Advisory Committee. I don't know how much of the agenda HOTAC issues are, but I think it's a fairly substantial amount. And so Thea and Sean will be talking to the RAC, obviously going into the broad versus narrow referral question, and also asking a couple other questions for RAC consideration. And then our next meeting of the HOTAC is on May 7th. And so we will do a debrief of what we heard at the RAC, and then also frame up at least one question, maybe a couple, and probably with some alternatives for you to grapple with. So we're going to start getting a little less high in the air of some of these like kind of philosophical questions, and actually now start digging into the details. What about this versus this? And what are the pros and cons, so that we can tee up the next set of policy questions for the RAC. So our goal isn't to like resolve all of these issues, but to make sure that when the RAC starts grappling with some of the policy questions around these complex components, that they have a full complement of what the pros and cons and considerations and factors that you as technical experts can offer up, so that their policy conversation can be fruitful. We wouldn't want for them to go off in a direction on a policy tangent without having the benefit of your great expertise. So we really appreciate your effort and your continued participation. And just want to offer up some space here. Does anybody have any questions about next steps before we close? Okay, well then.
I'll just say, sorry, before we let everybody go, Cadence. I think that this, I think I just want to recognize that this conversation is like a little bit frustrating right now, because it is so sort of ephemeral. It's, it's very much floaty right now. And we will, I promise, start to get some things that we can, some things that we can actually push against. So keep that in mind. I appreciate you all, really participating as, really great partners in this up till now. You know, even though it's kind of this very abstract exercise.
More
And for what it's worth, this abstract exercise has been very helpful for helping us think through like, oh, how can we structure these potential alternatives, that type of thing. And we'll get more into the nitty gritty. And of course, we'll just, we don't have anything decided or anything set up, but we can start grappling with some of those more specifics. And this feedback has really been quite helpful for that. So I just want to express and double down on that appreciation.
All right, folks. Hope you get to enjoy some of that nice weather out there. Have a good afternoon. Bye.